This wave, this movement into a realization of reindustrialization of defense tech needed in the US, are you seeing enough, well, buyer activity, the government realizing this and allocating money for you to put your money to work in an early stage?
Yeah, well, thank you so much for having me, Caroline. It is so interesting to see what has happened in a really short period of time. We launched Construct Capital early in 2020, pre-COVID 2020, with this belief that we needed to see productivity, technology enter what we describe as foundational industries, areas like manufacturing, supply chain, logistics, certainly defense tech. Because when you look at the numbers, productivity was declining in these spaces. It was literally taking longer to do the work. 100 hours of work was taking longer than it had 10, 15 years ago. And of course, in other sectors, we've seen tremendous growth from a productivity standpoint. So we really felt like now was the time to focus on these spaces. But as you point out, there's a tremendous amount of interest, a tremendous amount of investor interest coming into these spaces. There's been a 20x increase in Series B dollars going into these spaces since 2020 when we launched the fund to today. And certainly Hill in the Valley Forum was a knockout event, sold out. You couldn't get anywhere near the space if you really didn't, you hadn't really been building something legitimate in this space. And so we're very excited. We're very encouraged by the amount of interest, but the contracts have to follow. But these spaces are big, they're important, and we're convinced, that there are a set of companies that are really going to break out here.
You and Dana Grayson have, as you mentioned, been doing this since 2020. Let's say before it got cool. And now everyone piling in. How have you distinguished yourselves with LPs? How have you managed we're looking at your portfolio companies, the growth in Hadrian, for example, is that what's brought people forward to want to back the next fund?
Well, I think, first of all, we didn't turn our attention here. We weren't a crypto investor or Web3 investor in 2020, 2021 when that was cool. We have been dedicated our entire careers, really, to investing and operating in and around these spaces. I joined Uber in 2011 when they had just had a Series A. Everyone told me I was crazy to go join a taxi company. Their words, not mine. But it was slow-moving, heavily regulated, high CapEx. And, of course, Uber is none of those things. Dana, similarly, investing at NEA. In and around the earliest SaaS in the cloud, the earliest 3D printing companies, these companies that were not seen as venture scale outcomes when we made those moves. And I think founders, LPs certainly recognize that.
There is a distinction between an effort to reindustrialize and what's happening in defense technology. And there is a distinction on the policy side with artificial intelligence. But what broadly connects all of those is this administration focusing on cutting red tape, expediting permitting, and basically giving political will to bring more things back to America. At the early stage, how does that present an opportunity?
Yeah, that's a great point. And I really see, many of these companies are dual use companies. And I think that's important to distinguish. There are a lot of amazing companies in the defense tech space, but companies like Hadrian didn't start just selling into governments. And I think particularly at the early stages, the sales cycles are still long. You need to have a lot of different compliance requirements. Getting into one of these government contracts can be critical, can be company moving. But fundamentally, what excites us about these companies is half the GDP sits within foundational industries. These are massive spaces. There has been almost no technology incumbents. And when you think about AI and you think about sort of what we can do, we can really leapfrog forward. We are never going to be as good as China or other countries at sticking a large number of people doing repetitive tasks over and over. And software can change that. Software is what we are excellent at. Innovation is what we are excellent at. And I think there's broad recognition there.
Do these companies have a future that's more focused on selling to government and the public sector? Or is there an addressable market where all of these different companies are doing business with one another? I think there's a real distinction there, too.
Yeah, I think you need volume, you need the supply chains, you need and those things happen in a very symbiotic way. You know, what we see is there are a lot of companies that are using maybe their commercial non-government contracts to sort of build up initial capabilities, to build up supply chains, to start developing the relationships they need. And then you get one of these massive needle-moving contracts like Hadrian just announced last week with the Navy, and that can just completely accelerate a company's trajectory.